April 1945, Fort Lyon in Bent County, Colorado. Fanny Garner, who was born Fanny Miller, has made her way here to make an application that her son Daniel J. Garner return from serving overseas. This is not a typical request, but after everything Fanny has endured, this is not a typical situation. Fanny's request would eventually reach U.S. Senator Edwin Carl Johnson, who would personally see to it that the U.S. War Department investigate Fanny's case. Hello everybody, I am Joe Ross, the GeneaVlogger, and on today's video we'll be discussing Max Miller's family's World War II service. On the previous episodes on Max's family, we focused on his maternal side, but in today's video we'll start to look at his paternal side. Max's paternal grandfather, Ross Melvin Miller, was born July 12, 1921 in Joplin, Missouri, to Arthur Miller and Nova Maxwell, dairy farmers who had both grown up farming with their parents. Ross was the oldest of three children, with a younger sister born in 1922 and a younger brother born in 1926. In early 1927, Ross's father Arthur contracted an inflammatory rheumatism of the heart, and 5 months later would also contract pneumonia. After 10 months of suffering from multiple illnesses, Arthur died on September 26, 1927, at the age of 28, with three young children at home, including Ross, age 6, Fleda Lucille, age 4, and Norman, who was just 1 year old. Nova would continue working as a dairy farmer while her children attended school, although Ross and his sister Fleda would leave school early, both only completing up to 10th grade. And I thought this might be because they needed to help out their mom at home. In the 1940 census, just a few years after they both left school, Ross was listed as a dairy farm helper, and his sister Fleda Lucille was doing housework. But when I met up with Max and his family, I thought I'd ask them if they had any idea why this might be, which brought an interesting answer from Max's father, Tim. Do you know why he most likely left school?
He just told me he hated it.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, but what's the real reason?
He used to brag because he said my mother would drop, when he was little, my mother would drop me off at school and she would drive back home and I'd be waiting for her because I'd cut through the fields to get there.
No, I wasn't 100% sure, so that was one of the reasons why I wanted to ask, but one of the reasons I thought seemed most likely was because his father had died very young, and so his mother was at home working in dairy. But first, we're going to take a look. This is the obituary for his father, Arthur Miller. Died 28 years old. We aren't going to talk a whole lot about Arthur, but here we have the 1940 census, and you can see your father, Ross, and then his mother, Nova L. Miller.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look over here, Nova's occupation, she's working in dairy,
Mm-hmm.
and Ross is also working in dairy as a helper. Now, Lucille also had only finished up to her sophomore year. So if you look here, this line tells you what's the last year of school they graduated, and for both Ross and Lucille, it's H2, high school 2. But Norman was still in school.
Norman would be the only one of the three siblings to complete high school and would even go on to complete college, leading into a very interesting career path.
He became a rocket scientist.
Oh, I thought he was the architect.
No. My dad said that Norman hated farm work. Said, I'll never be a farmer. And he worked on the Redstone project with NASA.
Really?
Yeah. And then after he left NASA, he went to work as an engineer for M&M, Mars, Candy, in Cleveland, Tennessee, of all places.
Ross kept working as a dairyman, but in 1942 he was forced to register for the World War II draft. This was the third round of registrations in the US for the draft, but the first round done after the US had officially declared war. The first and second draft registrations in 1940 and 1941 only applied to men over 21 years old, which Ross wouldn't turn 21 until July 1942. But with the third registration, it required men 20 to 45 years old to register, forcing Ross to register for the draft on February 14th, 1942. Just a few months later, and Ross was drafted. Trying to learn about Ross's service during World War II was not going to be easy. Part of it had to do with the fact that in 1973 there was a fire at the National Personnel Record Center, destroying a bunch of records for World War II veterans. Another reason it wasn't going to be easy is because a lot of the other available records related to World War II service is not easily obtainable. So my first step to try to learn Ross's story was to turn to the newspapers, and I was able to find a good bit.
Now, what do you know about his time in the military?
He's a conscientious objector.
He's a nurse's assistant. He went in, he was a conscientious objector. He went through basic and everything, and they said, fine, we'll put you on the front line without a gun. And then he followed the armies around in hospitals. I know. Remember him talking about during D-Day, he worked in a big hospital set up in Oxford. That's where the Oxford
That's
was.
right.
And then he was Frankfurt, Germany. I think he was in, where's Mannequin Peace?
Brussels.
Brussels? I think he was in Brussels. Anyway.
Records for World War II vets are oddly sparse because there was a fire at an archive one year and destroyed a whole bunch of stuff. So the majority of records that we get usually have to come through FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests. We've submitted one, it's there, we're waiting for them to respond, it takes them a while. But we can still learn about his career through the newspapers, once again. So the first one here, we have January 11th, 1943, 30 Newton Countians leave for service, and he's listed as the first person on that list. So 1943, he's off to train. Then Wednesday, April 19th, 1944, Private First Class Ross M. Miller has arrived in England according to information received by his sister, Miss Lucille Barker of Joplin.
She was already married.
July 8th, 1944, so a couple of months ahead. Private First Class Ross M. Miller, stationed in England. Now this is really weird because they missed up 2 lines. So this third line should be the 4th line. So it should read, Private First Class Ross M. Miller, stationed in England, has been promoted to corporal according to information received by Nova Miller of Joplin, Route 3. So whoever was doing the newspaper did that backwards.
Congratulations,
So he gets promoted. Then, August 3rd, 1944, Miss Nova Miller has received information that her son, Norman M. Miller, apprentice seaman, is stationed at the Great Lakes Training Station. Another son, Corporal Ross M. Miller, is with a medical detachment in England. And now we have February 16th, 1946. So we're jumping 2 years ahead. I couldn't find anything in between. Norman M. Miller, Specialist, 3rd Class of the Navy, who's been in Joplin on emergency leave because of the illness of his wife, Miss Ellen Miller, has returned to Gainesville, Georgia. He's been in the service 19 months. A brother, Sergeant Ross M. Miller, so he's been
Sergeant, goodness,
is stationed at Frankfurt, Germany with the 97th General Hospital. He's been overseas 2 years and and recently met his brother-in-law, Private First Class Frankie Barker, at Le Havre, France. They spent 2 days together. Sergeant Miller also has met 2 cousins since being in Frankfurt, Sergeant Charles E. Shurich and Private First Class Nelson E. Ball. Norman Miller and Ross Miller are sons of Miss Nova Miller, 1010 Range Line. Now,
give her address.
he met Uncle Frenchie.
Yeah, Max, we need to write a historical fiction about Grandpa and Frenchie in France for 2 days.
Yeah.
While these newspaper clippings were great, it still wasn't enough to really learn about Ross's experiences during the war. So I decided to reach out to my friend and genealogy colleague, Alec Feretti. Alec is on the board of directors for Reclaim the Records, a non-profit activist group which fights against government entities that restrict access to records that should be in the public domain. Basically, they do a lot of freedom of information requests and a lot of litigation against these government entities. Alec had previously told me about a record set known as C files, which were basically records relating to a veteran's request for VA benefits. But the only way to access these C files was through a FOIA request. Luckily, Alec already had a bunch of experience in doing FOIA requests for these C files, so he got one started for Max's grandfather, Ross Miller. It took about 5 months to receive the C file after Alec had filed the request, which funny enough ended up being literally a week after I had just met up with Max and his family. The C file contains some very interesting records, including Ross's honorable discharge, known as a DD-214 certificate, and a form known as a WD-AGO Form 53-55, which details enlistment and discharge information, as well as decorations and citations received. Reclaim the Records has since set up a website where anyone can go and FOIA request these exact same records easily. Just go to birls.org and you can find your family and request those records. Well, the information in the C file was really interesting, and it did tell me a little bit more about Ross's experiences during the war. It still wasn't that much, and I wanted to learn much more about what his unit actually experienced and where they went. So I turned my research focus to his unit specifically, the 97th General Hospital. But I was surprised at how little information I could find on his unit. No books, very few articles, and most of the details I could find about the 97th General Hospital dealt with the unit after World War II because it remained a major military hospital for the US in Germany until about 2006. With time, I found more and more little bits of information, but then I found a website about the town of Wheatley in England, and they had a very interesting document. But even more interesting, the person they mentioned as having saved the document was Kestenbaum, a fellow Jewish genealogist who had even shown up briefly in one of my previous videos. And even more coincidentally, it was with Alec Feretti.
Same name. What is that?
This is the newest camera.
Oh my god.
Say hello.
Hello. Joy, say hello.
Hello, hello.
So I got in touch with Joy, and she was an absolute wealth of knowledge on the 97th General Hospital.
Yes, I'm Joy Kestenbaum. I live in New York City, and I'm a professional genealogist and a historic research consultant. So growing up, I knew that my mother had been a U.S. Army nurse in World War II. As we got older, I was curious about her World War II experiences. I mean, my father was also in the war, but it was a family joke that my mother was an officer and my father was just a private. When they were, seniors, and they moved to a senior residence, my mother actually handed me this, which is, this jacket contains the service record and allied papers of the individual shown above. And this is my mother's complete Army file, which is amazing because you and others probably know that at the National Personnel Records Center, millions of military personnel records were destroyed in the fire of 1973. So I'm lucky that I have this file. Also, my junior year abroad in Paris, my parents came over to visit, and then they traveled and went to England, and I met them in England, and we rented a car and went to Oxford, and we met the woman that my mother was billeted with. And that's part of the story. When the 97th General arrived in England, before they went to Wheatley, while it was being set up, at least the nurses, I don't know about everybody else, they were billeted with families for about a month. And we met the woman who my mother was billeted with. So I had heard stories, over the years. And then many years later, I interviewed my mother, and then I inherited all her, these papers and her uniform. I researched all the officers, the doctors and other officers, all the nurses, the Red Cross women, and I started researching Some of the men, if I found a connection between them and others, for example, some of the nurses married men from the hospital.
So from here, I think let's talk about, if you can talk about, I guess, just kind of the general history of the 97th, starting with when they're created. I think, was it 1943 that they started?
Yeah, well, it was activated June 25th, 1943 by the colonel. I have his picture, Colonel Knox Dunlap. Several of the people who were in that unit had their initial training at other places, but they had definitely were their final training before they went abroad at Fort Bragg. As far as the men who were concerned, who were enlisted men, as Ross was, it's very hard to know what their specific training was. I mean, obviously the doctors were medical doctors. The nurses, as I told you, were registered nurses with at least 3 years training. As far as the enlisted men, it really depended, because some of them went to special training schools before when they were initially enlisted, and they got special skills or technical experience. So, without the whole personnel file, it may be hard to know exactly what the individual did during the war. So they get to England. They arrived in Scotland in April 3rd, 1944, near Glasgow. And they were taken by trucks to the railroad and then brought down to England. The unit took command of the hospital on April 22nd. As far as the terminology for the hospital, obviously a general hospital was the most established. It was a hospital that stayed in one place, that had the best equipment for taking care of the patients. There were quite a few general hospitals that arrived in England from America in order to prepare for D-Day, and that's when they got really busy. The soldiers who were severely injured, they ended up at an evacuation hospital. They went through different triage, and it was from the evacuation hospital that they would be sent to the general hospital. The patients either were flown in or they were brought across the English Channel in what they called LSTs, which were landing ship tanks. And those were the same ships that were used in Normandy. So they were very important during the war. And then they were transported by train to different hospitals if they weren't flown in. Some of the enlisted men did the truck driving, and they were mechanics, and they could help with transporting patients or supplies. But others were more involved in helping out with taking care of the patients. There were a lot of responsibilities at a hospital. You can imagine all the things that would need to be taken care of, including the mess hall. There was one enlisted man I read about who had started studying pre-med, and he was in the laboratory section, and he co-invented some kind of utensil so that in the laboratory, the chemicals they were working with wouldn't stain the sink. So there were different specialties and training that the enlisted men had. So it would be curious to know what Ross Miller actually did. The hospital closed May 18th, 1945, and by then an armored battalion had captured this hospital in Frankfurt that had been a Luftwaffe hospital. Another army hospital moved into that hospital when the 97th was still in England. When they shipped out and went to Japan, and then the 97th general moved in. There were also German civilians who worked there. Some of them, had been Nazis. So one of the reasons my mother felt uncomfortable being in Germany, even though she told me, she was there for a little while, but then she applied to leave and go to France. So she ended up sort of leaving the hospital and going to Paris. And she got permission to study at the famous haute couture school in Paris.
But Joy had something even more amazing to share, especially when we consider we're talking about the family of Max Miller from the channel Tasting History with Max Miller.
One of the things in her scrapbook, which I'll talk about because it mentions Ross Miller, lists the names of all the whole staff of the Army unit. And Christmas, it was a Christmas menu from 1944.
So the person I'm doing this research for, Max Miller, his YouTube channel is Tasting History with Max Miller.
Oh my God.
And everything he does is all about historical food. And one of the things he does, he remakes old historical menus. So like one of the series he does,
I can show you the menu.
That would be amazing. Yeah, or that is amazing. I guess you already have it. So
yeah, so basically there's a little booklet that was published for Christmas 1944. And that's what has the menu and the names of everybody who served. And that's where I verified that he was a corporal at that date. This is the cover of the Christmas menu.
That's so cool.
And this is, the page that the colonel talks about our first Christmas near the completion of our period of a year ago. We found us near the completion of our period of training. That would have been at Fort Bragg. On this, our second Christmas, we have placed in operation all those things we learned in the early days. The willing cooperation of every member of this command has made this hospital one of the outstanding units in the United Kingdom. Okay, and then this is the menu. And here's a picture.
Yeah, that's perfect. From here, I decided to research Max's extended Miller family tree. And as I researched further, I soon found a very interesting and compelling story about some more cousins of Max's who had served during World War II. Max's second great-grandfather, Harvey Abraham Miller, was one of 5 siblings born to Abraham Miller and Nancy Matthews. Harvey's father, Abraham, died when Harvey was just 5 years old, similar to Harvey's grandson, Ross Miller, who was 6 years old when his father, Arthur, died, who was Harvey's son. Harvey only had one brother named James Henry Miller. James would move his family west from Missouri through Kansas and ended up in Oklahoma around 1906. It's through James's second youngest daughter, Fannie Miller, that we find this World War II story. Fannie married a man named Clark Garner in Oklahoma in 1914. The couple would have 9 children altogether, 5 of whom were boys. Sometime around 1920, they would move to Texas, and then by the end of the decade, they were living in Colorado. In 1940, the U.S. issued its first peacetime draft in its entire history in preparation for the possibility of war, requiring all men between the ages of 21 and 45 to register. Fannie's oldest son, Daniel, was 22 years old, so he had to register. In July 1941, the second draft registration focused on men who had turned 21 since the first draft registration in 1940. This draft would include Fannie's second oldest son, Virgil. Virgil would then be drafted and enlisted on September 24th, 1941. Daniel would also be drafted at this time and would be enlisted just a few weeks after Virgil on October 16th, 1941. A third son, Alva, would be drafted in 1942 in the third draft registration, the same registration which drafted his cousin, Ross Miller. Alva would end up enlisting in the Navy and serve on the Porpoise-class submarine USS Pickerel in the Pacific Theater of War, whereas his 2 older brothers were serving in the Army in Europe. The USS Pickerel would sink a total of 5 ships and damage 10 more in just 6 patrols. On their 7th patrol, they left Midway on March 22nd, 1943 after a quick refueling stop, but would never be seen or heard from again. The ship would be officially reported as lost on May 12, 1943. The USS Pickerel has never been found, and after the war, reports from the Japanese Navy were used to try to figure out what happened, although nothing conclusive was ever determined. Fannie would receive a Western Union telegram in June 1943 telling her that her son Alva was officially declared missing. On February 5th, 1944, Fanny's fourth son, Roy, turned 18 years old and registered for the draft the same day. Roy would be enlisted by June 1944, becoming Fanny's fourth son to be serving during World War II. Just a few months after Roy's enlistment, Fanny's husband, Clark, would die from peritonitis on September 22, 1944. And then a few months later, in December 1944, the house where Fanny and her children were living would catch fire and burn down, along with many of their possessions. And when that happened, Roy, Virgil, and Daniel were all in Europe fighting the war. Virgil was fighting in Belgium with the 358th Infantry as part of the famous Battle of the Bulge, but he went missing on January 13, 1945. His body would be found a month later, but wouldn't be officially identified until March 11, 1945. Fanny would receive a telegram about Virgil's death just a few days later on March 14th. The day after receiving this telegram, Fanny's son Roy would die after being shot in the head in Germany during the Battle of Remagen. Roy was part of the 310th Infantry Regiment, and they were on the race west to Berlin, having just crossed the Rhine by capturing the Ludendorff Bridge. This would become an extremely famous battle immortalized in many movies and documentaries. Just 2 weeks later, Fanny would receive news of Roy's death by telegram. In the span of 2 years, Fanny had lost 3 sons, a husband, her house, and many of her possessions. Upon learning the death of her third son, Fanny made her way to Fort Lyon to make a request that her son Daniel, the last son to be serving overseas, be brought back to the United States. This request then reached the desk of Senator Edwin Carl Johnson, who made it his personal mission that the War Department investigate the matter. Once it was decided to have Daniel return to finish his service in the States, Senator Johnson sent Fanny a telegram which stated, "Succeeded in getting authorization for your son Dan to be returned to the United States. He will be stationed somewhere in this country, Ed C. Johnson." I can't imagine how Fanny must have felt when she finally learned that her oldest son Daniel would actually be returning to the US. Fanny would spend the next few years working with the War Department to receive her son's possessions and having their remains reinterred in Colorado. I received a lot of records detailing this process thanks to records requested through FOIA request with Alec Feretti's assistance. These files included handwritten letters from Fanny to the War Department, which Max and his family were able to read as I had received these before visiting with them. Here, we have a letter from Fanny. If I could have one of you read it for me, please.
Maxwell.
Ma, this is Ma.
Let's see. So July 30th, 1945, Veterans Administration, Washington, D.C. I am enclosing what I understand to be the desired proof of relationship and age so that I may be entitled to receive my son's insurance. Just a broken-hearted mother. Oh, that's sad.
Roy and Virgil's remains would be repatriated and reburied in Colorado. While Alva's body was never recovered, a gravestone for all 3 brothers who lost their lives was erected in the Los Animas Cemetery. Daniel would go on to get married, having 4 children, and passing away in 2004 with many living descendants. If you'd like to see another episode of YouTuber Family Trees, be sure to check out this episode right here. Thank you to my Patreon patrons and YouTube members.